All right, thanks for the introduction. So I'm going to present about a stereoscopic 3D display technique that we're working on in the lab, and hopefully I'll convince you by the end of the talk that it has better spatial and temporal properties than existing methods. And I will point out that this is not an auto-stereoscopic display, so if that's why you're here, I'm sorry. But what are the existing methods for stereoscopic displays? The main problem we have with 3D displays, stereo 3D displays, is how do you send a different image to each eye on a single display screen? And so the main two ways that this is done currently are temporal interlacing and spatial interlacing, basically alternating the two eyes' images either in time or in space. So that's pretty much what it sounds like. So with temporal interlacing, you alternate the left and right eye images in time, and you would wear liquid crystal shutter glasses that are synchronized with the display, usually using infrared. And spatial interlacing is different. It sends, basically the even rows go to one eye and the odd rows go to the other eye. And the light being emitted from the display is usually polarized either linearly or circularly depending on the display. And you would wear corresponding polarized glasses that filter out the appropriate light for each eye. And now both of these methods, neither one is perfect. Temporal interlacing tends to have problems in time. So you get artifacts like depth distortion, and you'd get flicker or higher propensity for flicker, and potentially unsmooth motion and lower luminance as well. But spatial interlacing tends to have problems in space. So you can have an effectively lower resolution as possible. And this is something we found in the lab previously and confirmed in the current study. But we want to think about how to characterize these displays a little bit more rigorously. So let's think about just spatial resolution and depth distortion as the two ways we'll think about these displays for today's talk at least. There are more ways you can think about it, but I'm going to focus on this. So in terms of spatial resolution, temporal interlacing does really well because at each moment in time you're presenting a full resolution image to each eye. So you're limited only by the pixel density of your display and the content you can present. Whereas with spatial interlacing, we found that there is effectively a lower resolution image because you're presenting only a half resolution image to each eye. And let's look at this a little further because that might not be totally obvious why that is the case. So, because if you buy a spatially interlaced TV, there's one train of thought that says if you're presenting a half resolution image to one eye and you're presenting essentially the other half of the image to the other eye, then potentially you could combine the two images and get a full resolution percept. That's sort of the full fusion hypothesis here, and theoretically you could end up with a full resolution spatially interlaced display. But the reality is that that's not really what happens most likely. So basically, what we know about the visual system is we're a lot more likely to binocularly match the dark rows with each other. So if you're close enough to this display, even at the recommended viewing distance for an HD TV, which is 3 picture heights, these dark rows could be visible, and you're a lot more likely to binocularly correspond these dark rows with each other. So what you'll do probably is make a vertical vergence eye movement and align the dark rows with each other, and this would cause effectively a lower resolution image, not to mention the fact that there is a 1 pixel vertical shift which could cause kinds of artifacts. And manufacturers may do some sort of vertical line averaging to mitigate this, but no matter how you slice it, you're going to end up with a lower resolution image. And this is a result that we've found previously in a study and also confirmed in this current study. So that's a problem that we want to try and address. Another issue is that, and this is maybe less obvious, is that temporal interlacing tends to have depth distortions of depth caused by this delay between the left and right eye views, while spatial interlacing does not have that problem. So let's think about why that happens for a moment. So if you look at, say you have an object moving horizontally across the screen and you just plot its position over time on this kind of plot. So this is continuous motion. For a temporally interlaced display, you'd capture this motion at discrete moments in time, and if it's a sample and hold type display, you'd present left and right eye views like so. You'd present left, right, update, and you'd get something like this. And so if this object moving across the screen has 0 intended disparity, as is the case here, when the visual system tries to estimate what the disparity is, there's this inherent ambiguity on how to correspond the left and right eye views, because all the visual system sees is left, right, left, right, left, right. It doesn't necessarily know which left goes with which right eye image. So the visual system might see this left eye image and this right eye image and think, okay, so these are corresponding pair. The disparity here is 0. So at this moment in time, the disparity I'm going to estimate is 0. But just as likely, you're going to see this right eye image and this left eye image and think, okay, so this is a corresponding pair, and there's a disparity here. So 50% of the time, you're making the wrong estimation. And so your perceived disparity ends up being an average of the intended disparity and effectively the distance that the object moves at each frame. And so this is a problem. I don't know if you've noticed this in temporally interlaced displays, but it's particularly obvious in content with fast-moving objects, particularly sports. If a football is kicked across the field, it can actually look like it's behind the field, which makes no sense, and then as soon as it stops, it jumps back to where it's supposed to be. So it can be disturbing if you're if you want high fidelity content. So this is concerning. So neither of these methods are perfect. So we're interested in asking, is there a better way? Is there a stereoscopic 3D method that does not sacrifice spatial resolution and does not have any temporal artifacts like depth distortion? Also, flicker and motion artifacts are problematic as well with temporal interlacing. So that's where we get to our kind of spatio-temporal hybrid interlacing approach that we're proposing here. And sort of what it sounds like, it's spatial interlacing where the rows that get sent to each eye switch at every frame. So at one subframe, the left eye gets the even rows, the right eye gets the odd rows, and then at the next frame, it switches. So the left eye gets the odd rows and the right eye gets the even rows. And though it may not be obvious that this has better properties than either temporal or spatial interlacing, hopefully I'll convince you that it does, or at least maintains the benefits of both while eliminating the drawbacks. So let's think about how hybrid interlacing compares to temporal and spatial interlacing in terms of these two perceptual metrics. So for spatial resolution, we'll actually predict that it's going to perform as well as temporal interlacing. Now let's think about why that would be the case. It seems just as likely that it would perform terribly. But if we think about what we know about the human visual system, so recall that for spatial interlacing, the problem was that these dark, you're likely to align the dark rows with each other and cause a lower resolution image. But knowing what we know about contrast sensitivity of the human visual system, we're a lot less sensitive to high spatial frequencies like these at high temporal frequencies. So these static white lines will be a lot more obvious than, or dark lines will be a lot more obvious than dark lines that are moving really fast temporally, which is the case in the hybrid. So this full fusion hypothesis is a lot more likely to be the case. At least that's the model, that's how we predict, that's our prediction. But we want to test this prediction. So what we do is we have a setup in the lab where we can effectively model all three of these display protocols on a single setup. So we can control exactly what's going to each eye, and we don't have to worry about any differences in manufacture, et cetera, and we don't actually have to build this thing just to see if it works, if it's worth pursuing. So we have this setup here. And we ran a series of psychophysical experiments, subjects with good stereo vision and acuity, and to measure the effective resolution of these displays, we use a tumbling E task where we present an E like this and have the subjects indicate left, down, right, up. And we can control the effective pixel size and the stroke width of the letter. And what we want to do is find the smallest letter size that is just discriminable on this display. And the stroke width of that letter size is a measure, more or less, of the highest spatial frequency that we can present for a particular display technique. And so if we plot that threshold size as a function of the pixel pitch, the size of the pixel on your retina, we can figure out how these displays size up to each other. So a couple things to point out about this plot before I show you the results. So this 20/20 acuity limit line here, let's back up here. So this line, this horizontal line, is sort of the eye-limited resolution of your display. Some intuition behind that is if you were a mile away from your TV, it doesn't really matter what your pixel density is. It's all going to be blurred out to obscurity by your visual system, and so the pixel density is completely irrelevant. So that if you're way out to the right here, it's the human vision that matters. Whereas if you're really close up to your display, your pixels will be huge. So like here, the human optics will matter a lot less because the effective resolution of your display is going to be limited by the pixels, not your human vision. And so for any particular display on this plot, we'd predict the effective resolution to kind of follow this curve initially and then plateau along this as you get further out. And also, let me just point out that the recommended viewing distance for HD TV is right there. It's 1 arc-minute pixels. And so if I show you the result for temporal and spatial interlacing, before I show you the hybrid, we have this definite significant increase here in the spatial interlacing compared to temporal interlacing. So there's a lower effective resolution. Also point out that if you're at a certain viewing distance, so this is 6 picture heights basically, they're really the same because 2 rows will blur into 1. So if you're far enough away, it doesn't matter, but at close viewing distances, spatial interlacing does not perform as well as temporal. And we would hope that the hybrid protocol performs more like the temporal interlacing than the spatial interlacing. And that's pretty much what we found. And again, I'll point out that if you're at this distance here, they all appear about the same, but close up, the hybrid interlacing technique does really well. And particularly at this recommended viewing distance of 3 picture heights, the hybrid protocol is performing pretty well. So this is encouraging. This is suggesting that the hybrid performs more like temporal interlacing in terms of spatial resolution. So that's great. Now we want to think about depth distortion. Now, why would we not predict depth distortion for the hybrid protocol? So let's plot this hybrid again on a space-time plot like we did for temporal interlacing. The main message here is that because we're able to send content simultaneously to the 2 eyes, then there will be none of that ambiguity you had with temporal interlacing, and so you'll hopefully make all the right matches. And so we'd predict that the perceived disparity would be identical to the intended disparity based on this model. But we want to test this. So we ran a psychophysical experiment again where we measured the amount of depth distortion. And if you put on your anaglyph glasses, maybe this demo will work. I haven't actually tested on this display. But this is a temporal interlacing protocol. And because depth distortion is dependent on the direction of motion, the top and bottom will induce depth distortion in opposite directions. Is anyone seeing that? I don't know if it works. Yes? Great. So hopefully you will see this artifact, and I'll leave it up here for another 30 seconds while you pass out more glasses. But this is effectively the stimulus we use to measure depth distortion. And because we use horizontal motion because it's a temporal delay that is interpreted as a spatial offset, as disparity, essentially. And it's horizontal disparity that induces the perception of depth, which is why you get, in this case, I think the top should appear behind and the bottom in front. Yeah, so there is 0 disparity in this. And so the only disparity, the sense of depth you're getting is purely based on the temporal interlacing method that we're using. Yeah, so I have to skip now. So basically what we did is we took a bunch of subjects, we plot them down on our system here, our apparatus. We presented this to stimulus with 0 depth. And because it's temporally, or for whatever protocol we're presenting, the perceived depth may be non-zero. So it's perceived as something like this. And what we can do is manually, or using an adaptive staircase, we'll add this sort of nulling disparity so that until the top and bottom are perceived at the same depth. So in this method, this nulling disparity becomes a quantitative measure of how much depth distortion is happening in a particular display. And so if we plot that nulling disparity as a function of the speed of the stimulus, here's our predictions. Now these predictions are based on this equation on the left here, And it's based purely on the speed of the stimulus and the intraocular delay, basically the delay between the left and right eye views. And so for temporal interlacing, we see this diagonal line here. It's a function of the speed of the stimulus. And this, because the intraocular delay for temporal interlacing is non-zero, we'd get something like that. Whereas for the spatial and the hybrid interlacing techniques, the intraocular delay is effectively zero because we're presenting content simultaneously. And so if I show you the results for spatial interlacing, looks like that, pretty close to prediction. And for temporal interlacing, follows prediction pretty closely as well. And the hybrid is pretty flat. So this is great. This is pretty strong evidence that the hybrid interlacing technique does not have any depth distortion. So this is great. This means that it looks like the hybrid interlacing technique is basically taking the better of the two, the best properties of temporal and spatial interlacing while eliminating the drawbacks. And we have evidence that it also reduces flicker that you would see in temporal interlacing, and that motion could look better depending on how the content is captured. But so this is really good evidence that it really combines the best of both and should provide a better viewing experience. And in terms of actually implementing this display, it would be pretty reasonable to do if you incorporated some sort of temporal switch into polarized glasses that switch the polarization at each frame. But yeah, it seems like it would be reasonable to do that. The glasses would be more expensive than probably shutter glasses or polarized glasses, but not by a huge amount. So yeah, and that's basically it. I wanted to thank Joohwan and David and Marty mostly, and Marty Banks' lab. Any questions?
Great, thank you.